It begins at night over a desert so wide it swallows sound. An air defense network hums. Radars. Spinning, operators bored and blinking. Then, nothing. Not an alarm, not a glitch they can name. For roughly 20 minutes, the electronic heartbeat of a nation goes smooth and silent, as if someone pressed pause on the sky. By the time the screens flicker back to life, a building deep inside Syria, a boxy structure no one is supposed to ask about, is gone. It has been carved from the earth with precision, erased so cleanly a satellite might call it a mirage. There is no siren, no claim of responsibility, no victory parade. Just darkness in the desert, a secret that will not stay. Buried, and a rumor spreading through military channels. Israel's Mossad found something, and the Israeli Air Force hid it. The rest is quiet. The rest is deniable. The rest is the story of how you blind a country for 20 minutes and change the map without moving a single border. To understand how a 20-minute blackout could rewrite the calculus of a region, you have to start years earlier with a question intelligence officers hate. What are we missing? In the early 2000s, while the world fixated on Iraq, another rumor pulsed through the backchannels. Syria, led by Bashar al-Assad, was building something secluded along the Euphrates, far from the corridors of Damascus. The chatter was foggy, procurement lists that didn't add up, shipments routed through friendly ports, technical consultants who checked in from Pyongyang of all places. Deception is an old game in the Middle East, but the pattern bothered analysts on both sides of the Atlantic. In Tel Aviv, the head of Israel's Mossad, Meir Dagon, had a talent for skepticism and for action. He had remade the agency into a harder-edged instrument after the violence of the Second Intifada, leaning into human sources, quiet break-ins, and the kind of patient technical work that doesn't show up in headlines. Mossad wasn't looking for a fight. It was looking for clarity. That clarity arrived, according to later accounts, in a hotel room in Vienna, where a Syrian official enjoyed a comfortable European routine. The story goes like this: while the official was at dinner, a Mossad team slipped into the room, made a copy of his laptop, and slipped out again. It's the spycraft cliché that rarely proves true. This time it did. On that hard drive were photos, clean, unmistakable frames, of a construction project near Deir Ez-Zor, a nondescript, boxy building rising in the desert, its inner chamber shaped with suspicious care. Other images showed North Korean technicians, familiar to nuclear analysts, the way car people can spot a classic model at a glance. This wasn't a warehouse. To the trained eye, it looked like a reactor. In fact, it resembled the Yongbyon design, the heart of North Korea's program. Israel handed the material to the United States. In Washington, the intelligence community does not shock easily, and it does not sprint. There were arguments. If this was a reactor, was it complete? Had fuel been loaded? Were we looking at a mirage, an empty shell designed to draw a costly, reckless strike? The CIA and other agencies pored over the images, matched them with satellite passes, bus schedules, fuel orders, water intake constructions. Eventually, the skepticism cracked. A quiet consensus formed. There was a reactor, the kind that could produce plutonium, and it was not yet operational, which meant any strike would carry no danger of radiation release. That mattered. For Israel, it mattered even more. Israel has a doctrine born in 1981, when its Air Force destroyed Iraq's Osirak reactor in a daring afternoon strike that the world condemned and then, grudgingly, came to understand. Never again, the doctrine says. Never allow a hostile neighbor to reach nuclear capability. It is called the Begin Doctrine after Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and it shaped the instincts of Israeli leaders decades later. The choice, in their telling, was not between war or peace. It was between a quiet, deniable hit now or a strategic nightmare later. The call between Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and U.S. President George W. Bush was not public, but accounts of it drifted into memoir and briefing rooms. Bush listened. American options were considered. In the end, the United States withheld the trigger. Israel did not. "If you won't act," Olmert essentially said, "we will." Behind that phrase stood the same mosaic of Israeli power that has existed since the state's founding. Intelligence and air, secrecy and speed. Mossad had found the needle. The Israeli Air Force would thread it. Planning began in earnest. The target had a name, Al-Kabar, an isolated complex near the Euphrates River, disguised as a military facility. In Israeli documents, the operation would be called Outside the Box. In Washington, it became known as Operation Orchard. The nickname did not matter. What mattered was that the strike had to accomplish three things. Simultaneously, destroy the reactor beyond repair, leave no question that it was gone, and avoid a war. You can't do that with bombs alone. So the plan used three wings: clandestine intelligence, electronic warfare, and precision air power. Mossad's job wasn't over. Intelligence officers had to be certain, absolutely certain, that the building contained what the photos suggested. According to reports, there were additional infiltrations, including soil and debris sampling. Some accounts suggest a small Israeli special operations team crossed the border to plant laser designators or collect proof. Other accounts deny it. Either way, the consensus among Israeli and American analysts solidified. This was a reactor, built with North Korean help, engineered for plutonium, and not yet fueled. The electronic warfare piece was built around a deceptively simple ambition: make Syria's air defenses stop seeing. The country's Soviet-era radar network was extensive, a web designed to warn of intruders and cue missiles toward their heat. Israeli planners, working with the intelligence unit known as 8,200 and electronic warfare specialists, prepared a set of tools, rumored to include an American-developed system known as Suitor. The alleged capability: slip inside the air defense network, inject false targets, or blank the screens entirely. If you could make a radar think the sky was empty for 20 minutes, you could put jets where they had no business being. The pilots would be F-15I RAM and F-16I Sufa, the long-legged strike fighters of Israel's 69th Squadron, and others, loaded with precision-guided munitions. The route would hug the seams of coverage using the folds of the earth and the mathematics of radio waves. They would likely brush Turkish airspace, drawing a protest later when empty fuel tanks fell north of the border. The strike would be surgical, clinical, almost impersonal. The preparation was none of those things. The night came. By most accounts, it was September 5th into the 6th, 2007. In the quiet of late evening, the jets lifted, their presence masked by routine and by silence. Back in Israel, a room of senior officials watched a wall of feeds. Somewhere else, Mossad officers waited. They had brought the operation this far. They would see if their reading of the puzzle held. Crossing a border in peacetime is a study in contradiction. It is both the most daring and the most pedestrian thing a pilot can do. The formation dropped to low altitude, hugging the terrain. In a Syrian air defense bunker, a radar operator glanced at a calm green sweep. The systems were up. The frequencies were normal. The sky was empty. This is what electronic warfare looks like to the target. Not static, not alarms, not the fireworks of a Hollywood hacking sequence. Just normal. Normal, and then a perfectly timed absence of anything at all. For roughly 20 minutes, the number quoted in many accounts, the network didn't see the formation that had slipped into its air. Thought it saw nothing. In that controlled absence, the jets climbed, aligned, and released. Precision weapons fell toward a cubic building near the river. If there was a ground team nearby, their work was already done. If there wasn't, the targeting pods and coordinates were more than enough. The first impacts tore the roof. The next lanced through internal structures that only a nuclear engineer would recognize, but any pilot would understand needed to be pulverized. The final bombs erased the rest. Back on the screens, the green sweep swept on. Somewhere, an operator frowned. Somewhere else a phone rang. Then the jets were already gone, the desert swallowing their echo, heading back toward a border that would welcome them as if nothing had happened. In a command center in Israel, a line of faces eased. The scene was quiet. There would be no public photographs, no live feeds, no televised speech. The silence wasn't just strategy. It was part of the weapon. In Damascus, the narrative had to be chosen carefully and fast. The Syrian government had to balance three truths. A strike had occurred, a nuclear facility had been destroyed, and admitting either could invite a spiral they couldn't control. The path they took was the oldest one in statecraft. Be vague. The official version was a generic claim of airspace violation repelled by air defenses. No mention of a destroyed reactor. No promise of retaliation. In a region where pride and power often fuse, this was remarkable. It also made sense. To protest too loudly would be to advertise the thing you had tried to hide, and to explain why your radar had slept through a 20-minute visit. The cleanup started fast. Bulldozers scraped the site until it was a scar. Trucks carried away remains. A roof went up over what had been a secret, only now it was a cover story. The idea was simple. If you erase the wound fast enough, maybe there was no wound at all. But satellite images are patient. So is the International Atomic Energy Agency. Inspectors eventually took samples that showed traces of processed uranium, not proof of an operational reactor, but evidence that the facility was indeed part of a nuclear effort. In 2011, the IAEA concluded the building had very likely been a nuclear reactor under construction. In 2018, Israel declassified its hand, formally acknowledging the strike and releasing a curated glimpse of the deliberations that led to it. Why the silence for so long? Partly tradition, partly the quiet bargain of the region, where enemies often hold each other's secrets when holding them serves both sides. Israel wanted to avoid pushing Syria into a corner where it had to retaliate. Syria wanted to avoid a spotlight that could invite more. The United States, which had been briefed but did not pull the trigger, kept its own counsel. It wasn't until years later that memoirs and hearings filled in more of the picture. The laptop in Vienna, the meetings in Washington, the Israeli model of the reactor used to practice the strike, the electronic intrusion that made an entire country's sky go smooth for a few critical minutes. There is a romance to these stories that can feel uncomfortable. It's easy to lean into the glamour of covert teams in hotel rooms, of screens going blank at command, of jets slipping past borders like shadows. But the stakes here weren't cinematic. They were strategic. The operation did more than remove a building. It reinforced a doctrine. It told adversaries and allies that Israel would not live with certain kinds of risk. It also underscored a lesson that matters just as much in Silicon Valley as it does in Damascus. There are moments when invisibility is more powerful than force. In this case, invisibility lasted roughly 20 minutes. That was enough. If you're looking for heroes, you can find them in the predictable places. Pilots who train for years to deliver iron on coordinates. Analysts who stare at pictures until their eyes water. Case. Officers who convince a man in Vienna to trust a lie or, more likely, never know the lie was coming. But the more interesting hero is the system, the patient accumulation of small advantages. Mossad couldn't fly jets. The Air Force couldn't break into a Syrian official's laptop. Unit 8200 couldn't decide when to use a capability, and politicians couldn't fly into a desert night and drop bombs. Only when all of it moved as one could you make a radar think the sky was empty and make a nuclear reactor vanish without a war. There were costs, as there always are. Electronic tricks once used reveal something about technique. Allies whose airspace is brushed, like Turkey's, lodge protests and reconsider the boundaries of friendship. Adversaries study the failure and adjust, buy new systems, ask new questions. And the secrecy that shields an operation also shields how close the world came to not finding out. How easily a reactor can rise in a desert when the world is looking elsewhere. This is the uneasy equilibrium of the shadow world. You act and your action teaches your enemy how to stop you next time. The 20 minutes matter because they dramatize the point. The most important part of the strike wasn't the boom. It was the blank. For roughly a third of an hour, a modern state with a powerful military saw nothing where something was happening. Think about your own life, measured in that time. Boil pasta, walk a dog, scroll your phone. That thin slice was the difference between a region waking up to a nuclear-armed Syria a few years later, or waking up to bulldozers scraping dirt over a mistake it hoped no one would ever notice. Of course, it's never that simple. Some critics argue that strikes like these kick problems down the road, buying time at the expense of secret wars that never end. Others counter that time is the most valuable commodity of all. Decide for yourself. What's clear is that intelligence isn't a superpower. It's a system of imperfect humans making bets based on partial truths. In this case, the bet, backed by painstaking detail, was that destroying a reactor at night under the cover of a silence engineered by code would keep a door closed that should never have been opened. Years later, even those who oppose Israel's policies often concede the narrow logic of that choice. And yet, for all the talk of doctrines and details, this remains a very human story. Somewhere in Vienna, a man put his laptop on a desk and went to dinner. Somewhere in Israel, a woman set down a cup of coffee and leaned closer to a photograph that would keep her up for a week. Somewhere in Syria, an officer stared at a perfect sweep that meant everything was fine when nothing was fine at all. And somewhere over the desert, a pilot looked down at a set of coordinates that existed in the world for only a moment, a dot in a window that would disappear the second after he touched a button. When Israel finally acknowledged the strike publicly, a decade had passed. The official video featured grainy imagery, a clipped voice. The acknowledgement wasn't triumphal. It was the bureaucratic tone of a country that has learned, over bitter decades, to talk about these things without talking about them. The message was more to future planners than to past enemies. We will act when we must, in ways you will find hard to see, and we will not expect applause for doing it. It's tempting to end with certainty, with grand claims about deterrence or inevitability. But secrets don't lend themselves to easy endings. The Middle East remains a map written in pencil, its boundaries subject to storms. Technology changes. So does ambition. The lesson of that night over Syria is not that Israel can blind any country at will. It's that the difference between seeing and not seeing is sometimes the difference between war and a surgical absence most people never learn about until years later. So think of those 20 minutes the next time you hear a story that feels tidy. Somewhere, someone engineered a silence so clean it looked natural. Somewhere else, someone misread that silence because they had to. The hit in this story wasn't just a bomb falling in the desert. It was the ability to make reality look normal until reality had already changed. And maybe that's the unsettling truth we're left with. Power in our age isn't just what you can strike. It's what you can make the world not notice until the moment it's too late to do anything at.